We'll have a wonderful. Ah, okay. Now I hope they're starting. Yeah. That's good. Professor Birx, can you hear us? Can you see us?
Yes, I can hear and see you. Yes.
Okay, fantastic.
All is fine.
Okay, because Professor Frost and Professor Kenner are here, and Professor Cecil.
Dear colleagues, it is my great honor and pleasure to greet Professor Dr. James Birx, world-known anthropologist and professor of anthropology. Professor Dr. James Birx is a permanent and full professor in European Center for Peace and Development of the University for Peace, established by the United Nations, and distinguished professor in the Faculty of Theology at the University of Belgrade. As an author of over 500 academic publications, Professor Dr. James Birx has been an invited visiting scholar at the University of Cambridge and twice at the Harvard University, as well as at many colleges and universities around the world. Now, I will give the floor to the Professor Dr. Liljana Markovic. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Tasevska. I would just like to introduce a few more wonderful facts about our dear Professor H. James Birx. We are privileged to have in our professorial corps here at ECPD of the United Nations University for Peace, the greatest social and cultural anthropologist of our day and age, Professor Birx. Professor Birx is also a professor emeritus of his Canisius University from New York, where he has spent all his active working life. And this was always a basis of his research and his interests. And this is where he returns with publications as well as with this glory and fame, which he has decided to share with us gathered around his lecture today. It is not only a great honor and privilege to have Professor Birx among us, it is also a great source of learning, a permanent source of learning for all of us. His research and his work has always been entirely multidisciplinary and very broad in its outreach. He has published and edited and contributed to some of the most important publications published by the famous publishing house Sage. Like, let me just mention a few of them, a few of these 500 publications. This is the 5-volume Encyclopedia of Anthropology. These are enormous volumes, A3 size, absolutely perfectly written and edited. Then a 3-volume Encyclopedia of Time, published again by Sage. And we know how prestigious Sage is as a publisher. And also a 2-volume Encyclopedia of Anthropology in the 21st century, likewise by this leading world publisher in our humanities and social sciences field. Professor Birx's book got the highest achievement prize, and it was really honored and is known throughout the world. He did a lot of research in the Galapagos Islands, also with Berute Galdigas. The study of the behavior of chimpanzees is eternal. And of course, starting with his doctoral dissertation, which was actually inspired by the work of Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, under the famous leadership of his mentor, Professor Frank Frost, whom we are celebrating in this lecture this evening, has given new perspective, new dimension, and has thrown new light to our view of social sciences, not only of cultural anthropology, but also of our view, which gathers together, joins up the evolution theory with other paradigms that we find so useful in the social sciences and humanities as we know them today. I will not take up any more of your precious time. I will ask Professor H. James Birx to take the floor and deliver this lecture that we have all been looking forward to so much. Professor Birx, the floor is yours.
I want to welcome everybody to my presentation, which is on a very incredible human being, Pierre Teilhard de Chardin. Teilhard was an interesting intellect because he was interested at one and the same time in science and theology. In fact, he will spend his life trying to synthesize evolutionary science with process theology. So let's take a look at his life and his thought, which is, as I said, an incredible journey. It began with his childhood in southern France, where he had an interest in pebbles, which evolved into an interest in rocks and fossils as a geologist and paleontologist. Now, Teilhard's worldview went far beyond the beliefs of and ideas of Aristotle, Augustine, Aquinas, and in fact, his vision went far beyond the worldview of Charles Darwin. It began as a result of his, as I said, interest in fossils and rocks. As a youngster, he strived to find a permanent substance. He was interested in permanence, and he thought that he found something permanent in a piece of plowshare, which he buried under the porch of his home until after a thunderstorm a few days later, when he went to see his so-called genie of iron, he found that it had rusted. He tells us that he then threw himself on the ground and cried the bitterest tears of his life. He would spend the rest of his life looking for another permanent, incorruptible object, which we will see evolving in his thoughts, his philosophical view of the world. Teilhard desired to become a Jesuit. He became a Jesuit and eventually a Jesuit priest. But during this time, he had the opportunity to visit Egypt. Now, his stay in Egypt for several years was extremely important because here he could develop his geological and paleontological expertise by searching for fossils in the hills near Cairo. It is during this time that he reflected, no doubt, on the Sphinx, the pyramids, the fossils he found in the hills, and the Sahara Desert. This gave to Teilhard a conception of the vastness of time, which stayed with him the rest of his life. He did spend several years teaching at the Holy Catholic School in Cairo, and he did research, as I said, in the hills. But after several years, he left Egypt and went to England, where he would finish his theological training and become a Jesuit priest. Now, besides his growing awareness of time, thanks to his stay in Egypt, Teilhard had the fortunate opportunity to read Henri Bergson's Creative Evolution of 1907. Now, Bergson at that time was becoming one of the most influential philosophers in the world. In 1903, he had written an introduction to metaphysics. Bergson argued that there is a separation between the natural world of science and reason on the one hand, which deals with objects, and reality itself as he saw it, which is known by the human being through the use of intuition, which involves time, flux, and in fact, evolution as a creative process. When Teilhard read Bergson's Creative Evolution, he became convinced that evolution is a fact of reality. It's important to note that Teilhard was influenced by Birx and not the scientist Charles Darwin, because Birx appealed to Teilhard's own interest, a metaphysical interest in time. Accepting evolution, Teilhard now had the challenge to reconcile science with theology in a new philosophy that was process. The flux of reality for him was real. It was the essential characteristic of all of nature. After becoming a Jesuit priest, Teilhard participated in World War I. What is interesting about his stay in Europe during World War I is that he emerged from this horrific time more optimistic than ever. In fact, he had several mystical experiences in this time of his life. Teilhard, committed to evolution, had his own ideas about Adam and Eve and original sin. So he wrote essays, one in particular about original sin, in which he attempted to explain original sin in terms of evolution. Very briefly, he thought that the universe is imperfect, but it's evolving and becoming more and more perfect. And thus we are moving away from evil and more toward the divine. This essay on original sin, unfortunately, fell into the hands of some of his Jesuit superiors. Now, of course, Teilhard's personal interpretation of original sin in terms of evolution did not agree with the beliefs of the Roman Catholic Church at that time. And so Teilhard was silenced. He was told that he could not publish his writings, only those dealing strictly with his scientific research. And in fact, he was removed from France and sent to China. Now, here is the irony of ironies in Teilhard's life. Because of his ever-growing evolutionary view, they send him out of France to China, and at that time, China would provide the scientific world with the most significant fossil human site in the world. And Teilhard, who was in Peking, would participate in research at this fossil site, Zhao-Cao-Dian. He became world famous for contributing to the geology and paleontology of this site. Also during this time, he had the opportunity to do research in the Ordos Desert in Inner Mongolia. And while he was there, reflecting on evolution, no doubt reflecting on human evolution in particular, he wrote his first book, The Divine Milieu. Now, the milieu that he's talking about is, of course, the human environment, and it includes a divine environment, the environment of God. In this divine environment, humans are evolving toward a distant endpoint. When Teilhard asked for his essay, The Divine Milieu, to be published, publication was denied. Now, following his stay in the Ordos Desert, he returned to France and then was sent back to China, to Peking, China, where he participated, fortunately, in the excavation of the cave at Zhao-Cao-Dian, where the all-important fossil hominid evidence belonging to Peking man or Pithecanthropus pekinensis. These finds convinced Teilhard more than ever of the fact of evolution. As a geologist and a paleontologist, he contributed to the analysis and interpretation of the rocks and fossils and artifacts found at Chardin. During this time, Teilhard had the luxury of time to think about the vastness of time, to think about creative evolution, to think about where our species fits into the grand scheme of things, the evolutionary framework. He wrote The Phenomenon of Man, pages each week, over a period of 2 years, from 1938 to 1940. Finally, his synthesis was finished, and he asked for permission to publish The Phenomenon of Man. But as with his first book, The Divine Milieu, The Phenomenon of Man was denied publication. And of course, Teilhard was devastated. Many essays, articles, and books on Pierre Teilhard de Chardin deal with his struggle with the Roman Catholic Church to publish his book, The Phenomenon of Man. But these books, essays, and articles many of them fail to explicitly discuss Teilhard's philosophy of evolution. What did he think about evolution? Why was it so controversial for the Roman Catholic Church? Let me give you the 4 basic concepts of Teilhard's synthesis of evolution. Concept number 1, the universe is not quintessentially matter or energy, but it is essentially spirit. So for Teilhard, we are evolving in a spiritual universe. Secondly, evolution, at least on the earth for Teilhard, is following the law of complexity consciousness. That is, through time, the products of evolution are becoming more and more complex and more conscious, until we get to the human being, who is the most complex animal we know of, and whose consciousness is actually self-conscious. Thirdly, critical thresholds. Teilhard believed that from time to time, a critical threshold is crossed in the process of evolution, and a whole new level or realm, or as we will see, circle of evolution emerges. The first critical threshold was between energy, between energy and matter. The second between matter and life. The third between life and thought. And now, eventually, there will be a sphere of spirit. This brings us to his 4th concept, the omega point. For Teilhard, evolution is evolving toward a final goal, an ultimate synthesis of the consciousnesses of human beings with a supreme being, the personal God of Christianity. He called this endpoint the omega point, or point omega. These were his 4 basic ideas. 1, a spiritual universe. 2, the law of complexity consciousness. 3, critical thresholds. And 4, the omega point. If we take a look at his synthesis, we see that there are these 3 spheres on the finite sphericity of planet Earth. Geogenesis resulting in the geosphere, the material Earth. Biogenesis results in a layer of life on this planet and in the future, the convergence of all immortal souls or centers of consciousness will result in a supreme synthesis of thought or consciousness, which will eventually detach itself from the earth, transcend space and time, and be united with a personal God, the creator, sustainer, and goal of evolution. Towards the end of his life, having been subjected to severe criticism by some of his superior Jesuits, Teilhard wrote a third book, Man's Place in Nature, the Human Zoological Group. In this third book, he attempted to present a far more scientific view of his interpretation of evolution in terms of the growing fossil evidence, particularly the evidence for human evolution. Unfortunately, his third book was also denied publication. Exiled from France, Teilhard was sent to do research in New York City. Now, it must be acknowledged that he could do his scientific research. He could publish scientific papers, but he could not teach or lecture or publish on his own personal interpretation of organic evolution. Teilhard, we could say, presented a phenomenology of evolution. That is, he was concerned with consciousness. He was concerned with intentionality. He was concerned with the essential structures of evolutionary history and with the creativity of the evolutionary process. Exiled from France, more or less alone in New York City, except for scientific friends and a few personal friends, Teilhard became a broken man. He died on Easter Sunday at 6 p.m. in 1955 and is buried in Hyde Park in the cemetery for the New York City province. Because of his death, the church had no control any longer about his writings. And so his 3 books were published. Numerous letters, essays, and articles were now published, those dealing with his philosophy of evolution. Unfortunately, only 2 years before his death, did Watson and Crick at the University of Cambridge discover the model of the DNA molecule. This would have helped Teilhard in his analysis of evolution, but I doubt it would have changed it very much because Teilhard was, as I said, committed to the personalization, the spiritualization of evolution in terms of the human species. As he saw it, evolution was from the inorganic through the organic to the superorganic, the human world, and will end with God at the omega point. Now, I'd like to compare Teilhard with 2 intellectuals, one, Galileo. You could argue that Teilhard is the new Galileo, silenced by the Roman Catholic Church because he discovered not that the earth isn't the center of the universe or that the earth moves around the sun, but he discovered for theology that species move, species evolve, including our own. And like Galileo, Teilhard had been silenced. Now, another intellectual beyond Galileo, who Nietzsche reminds us of, is Friedrich Nietzsche, the German philosopher. Now, Nietzsche claimed that God is dead. He was an atheistic existentialist. Now, Teilhard, of course, would never accept this, but Teilhard was concerned with involving God in his synthesis of evolution. Teilhard wrote that human values will become beyond good and evil, but not beyond good and bad. And Teilhard's values, as I said, are grounded in Roman Catholicism. A modern interpretation of Christianity, which would include the fact of evolution. For Nietzsche, the universe is finite, the universe is spherical, it cycles over and over again in exactly the same way. Nietzsche's colossal idea of the eternal recurrence of the same. Interestingly enough, if this is true, this gives everything that exists, has existed, and will exist immortality. That is, Nietzsche has lived an infinite number of times. Teilhard, for Nietzsche, will live an infinite number of times. Everything repeats itself forever. Now, with Teilhard, the omega point represents the end of human evolution, and one does wonder what happens to the rest of the universe with its billions of stars and billions of planets and perhaps life forms elsewhere. If we take a look at Teilhard's controversial but interesting life, what were his final influences? One, the fact of evolution. As a Jesuit priest, Teilhard embraced the factual theory of organic evolution. He never doubted it. Two, he's an example of the value of scientific research, critical inquiry, and open investigations. He recognized the convergence of our species on this planet. In fact, he envisioned the coming of the internet. Information instantaneously circling around the world and shared by all human beings on this planet. And he knew that there would be the need to modernize theology and religion within a comprehensive framework or perspective of evolution. How may someone else interpret human evolution? Well, they could be a scientific naturalist and have a dynamic worldview grounded in secular humanism, anticipating transhumans and posthumans, and something that Teilhard was unaware of, the coming of artificial intelligence, the convergence of nanotechnology and bioengineering to produce a new form of human life. In fact, something perhaps beyond what would be recognizable as human life. One could take a truly cosmic perspective and not limit himself or herself to the planet Earth. One could argue that the end of human evolution has a sidereal destiny, for our descendants could exist on other planets, on other worlds, even beyond our solar system, in fact, possibly beyond our galaxy. There's also the possibility that our species in the future could become extinct. Now, Teilhard must have been aware of extinction throughout organic evolution, but he never considered the possibility that our species would leave the Earth or that our species would become extinct. Again, probably for theological reasons, he remained optimistic. We here today celebrate the 70th anniversary of his death, realizing that he is a very important thinker in terms of representing and contributing to an engaging interpretation of evolution, whether one accepts it in part or in whole. We do not forget the Jesuit priest and scientist Pierre Teilhard de Chardin on this, the 70th anniversary of his passing. In conclusion, I want to thank 4 individuals who have been very instrumental in the progress of my intellectual development. Marvin Farber, Liliana Markovic, Frank Frost, and my friend Branko Milicevic. I thank all 4 of them. I'm eternally grateful to each of them for helping me on my own journey, my own evolutionary journey. Thank you.
Dear Professor Markovic, can you take the floor, please?
Okay, I succeeded. Thank you so much, Professor Birx, for this magnificent lecture and for this so insightful analysis of the great scientist and the great Jesuit who marked the scientific thought of the 20th and, of course, of our centuries. I would like to say that we have learned a great deal and that we, helped by your research and by your insight, have become aware of this specific angle through which Pierre de Chardin has viewed the evolution of human race, of human brain, of human beliefs, of this particular blend of science and the wider worldview, because that's what his theological background actually added to his life, even though it was an unsurmountable stone in his lifetime. It still helped him become an original thinker and a most unique scientist. I cannot thank you enough. And again, I cannot say how incredibly proud we as professors at ECPD all are of your research, of your contribution, and of your own unique scientific worldview. We were blessed this evening by the presence of Professor Frank Frost, Professor Gnart, and many other distinguished professors, Professor Ziesel, and many other distinguished thinkers and our students, many people online. So I would like to ask Professor Tasevska to ask for the questions that there are in the audience in the hall, and I will ask the online audience to pose some questions that they would like to ask you in order to understand in more depth what you have so beautifully outlined this evening. So Professor Tasevska, please ask the audience in the hall to ask questions first. Hello. Are there any questions in the ceremonial hall audience?
This is a question. What is the significance of the discovery of the packing man for the development of science?
Well, the discovery of Peking man was extremely significant at that time in the 1920s and 1930s. It was the most important fossil hominid site in the world. and it yielded many fossil bones of Homo erectus. It yielded many stone implements of Homo erectus dating back 200 or 300,000 years. Now, of course, this was before human fossil sites were found in Africa. It was extremely important, and it still is, and research is still going on at Zalcaldian, and there is a museum about Peking man or Homo erectus or Pithecanthropus pekinensis there today. And Teilhard was very instrumental in discovering and interpreting much of the evidence, in popularizing the evidence. And as I said, it convinced Teilhard more than ever that human evolution is a fact of the natural world, that humans have evolved as a part of organic evolution on planet Earth. So I hope I've answered your question, because Teilhard was directly involved at this site, and this site at that time was the most important fossil hominid site in the world. And Teilhard was directly associated with it for many years while he lived in, at that time, Peking, China.
Thank you very much, Professor Birx. There is another question from here. Why were Pierre Teilhard de Chardin's principal findings so unacceptable to the Jesuit order, and because of that published only posthumously?
What was that last part? Why what?
And because of that, I can repeat all the question?
No, just the last part.
And because of that, because of this unacceptance, because of that, published only posthumously.
Oh, well, because many of his Jesuit superiors objected to and were probably embarrassed by Teilhard introducing the fact of evolution into theology. They didn't know how to handle it. I mean, how do you handle Adam and Eve? How do you handle original sin if you're committed to evolution? And Teilhard tried to incorporate original sin into Roman Catholicism in terms of the evolution of our species. Now, he was objected to by his superiors. He wasn't allowed to publish his books and his philosophical and theological essays because this was embarrassing to them. They had no way of incorporating human evolution into their theology. It just hadn't been done. And this is where Teilhard was unique. But as a scientist, he knew that organic evolution is a fact. And somehow, Roman Catholicism, its basic beliefs, had to be incorporated into this evolutionary framework. And he did the best he could at that time to incorporate the factual theory of organic evolution into Roman Catholicism. Now, he even went beyond Roman Catholicism in anticipating what he called a meta-Christianity, a worldwide Christianity above and beyond traditional beliefs that could incorporate evolution into understanding and appreciating the significance of our species now and in the future. So it was a challenge to Roman Catholicism, and he suffered because they could not accept the possibility of the fact of human evolution in terms of their traditional Roman Catholic beliefs. This is why he was so extraordinary, why he was so unique, and why he suffered for his creative and critical thought in terms of evolution and theology. In fact, he knew that for the church, the Roman Catholic Church, to remain modern, it must somehow align itself with science, and in this sense, in this term, in this way, the evolution theory.
Well, thank you very much. That was all from the audience here.
All right. Then may I ask to be permitted to ask the online audience if they have any questions to pose to Professor Birx, please.
Professor Markovich, you have a question.
Yes, I do. I was just modest and I wanted to give the floor to other people first, but I can pose my question first.
Thanks.
And still ask the online audience to think of their questions, because this was a very thought-provoking lecture, and a very deeply significant for all of us as human beings and as scientists, and of course also as mostly believing men and women. If you allow me, I will pose my question. I really want to know a bit more about the time of Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, who was evidently not only a Jesuit, a devout Jesuit priest, but who was also a great French patriot who went and fought for his country proudly in the 4 long years of the First World War, who suffered a lot of pain on the battlefield because he lost his brothers and saw many, many, many people dying around him. As the Psalm 91 would say, and you can see the people die next to you, 1,000 people die next to you, and you can see 10,000 people die by your right-hand side. He actually lived these words of the Psalm of the Bible, and he was saved by the Lord. He came back without any physical injuries, though his psyche, his soul was deeply affected by his experience of the First World War. We know from the point of view of the Silk Road studies how very important the Jesuit priests were in the east of Asia, in the cultural transfers. Let us just think of another grand Jesuit, Matteo Ricci, who was so important in China, not only at his day and age, but also as a maker of the first Chinese language dictionary. The Jesuits did the same in Korea and in Japan. And even now, one of the most high quality universities in Japan is a Jesuit university, the Sophia University in Tokyo, Jochi Daigaku. The Jesuit priests were so full of knowledge, so knowledgeable, and always having such a multidisciplinary view that it seems to be such a pity that the greatest of them in the 20th century, Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, who actually made a fantastic step up in going into a new paradigm, which should have been an evolutionary cognizance of a man who believes in the Christian faith, was so prohibited either by petty friends or colleagues, other Jesuits, jealousy or envy, or by the superior priests of the Order of Jesus, who did not have enough capacity to understand what he was trying to do. He was actually trying to evolve the Christian faith so that it could go on functioning in the changing world, because he was very aware of the fact that the scientific discoveries that he arrived at were true, were the facts. And he tried very hard to find a place for these facts within the Catholic dogma, or generally Christian dogma, because he knew that that was necessary for the continuance of this dogma itself, but he was not understood. And this is why his works were published only after his death. It was a time, I mean, his work in China was at the time of another great scholar, that was Sir Joseph Needham of the University of Cambridge, who wrote the 5-volume History of Science in China, making it for the first time widely known to the West what the traditional Chinese science, medicine, as well as alchemy, gave to the world, to humanity. And it was the time of colossal steps in the world of science and also in the world of the history of thought. So it was a shame that his works were not published before the Second World War, when they were written, or even during the war, because I think his work could have influenced humanity much more powerfully than in the 50s, when after his unfortunate death, his works were finally published. So please explain to us why his superiors could not understand the magnificence of his findings and of his worldview that he bequeathed to humanity in his works, which they prohibited from publishing.
Well, one thing that comes to my mind is that they were not prepared for an evolutionary interpretation of Christianity, life, and our species and the future. They had not studied evolution. It was something that I think they saw as a threat to their traditional beliefs. So that they just were not intellectually prepared to handle such a remarkably different view of the world. I mean, you're going from a Thomistic view, which is Aristotelian quintessentially, with an emphasis on fixity, to a worldview that's grounded in change, grounded in evolution. And I don't think they were prepared for such a dramatic change in views concerning Christianity, concerning the religious beliefs and values. I mean, and it was something new to them. I think it was a threat to them. How would they incorporate Teilhard into their traditional views unless they embraced his evolutionary framework, which of course they were not intellectually prepared to do? So there were some Jesuits who did not object to the publication, but his superiors did object, and so they weren't published. Now, it's a sad commentary on his superiors, some of them, that they did not give him the opportunity to express himself in print. It's also unfortunate that Teilhard didn't have the opportunity to answer critics who read his printed works. I mean, he was not able to answer religious thinkers or scientific critics. And he was, as I said, more or less at the end of his life alone. And he never saw his books published. And so this, as an author, I know how disturbing and how sad it would be, and really devastating it would be not to have your life work presented in books unpublished. I mean, we can only imagine how it bothered him at the end of his life in New York City to realize that he would die without his books being read by anybody else. A very sad situation for him.
Thank you very much. I do understand. And this made us all so impoverished, because if he were alive at the time of the publication of his key works, he could have explained his paradigm in a much more persuasive and clearer way to the humanity, to the whole intellectual community of the world, and could have made things change much more rapidly and contributed a lot to the development of science and human thought.
It's to Sir Julian S. Huxley's credit, a great evolutionary biologist during that time, one of the founders of the so-called synthetic theory of organic evolution, which incorporated natural selection and genetic variations with population studies, that he wrote the introduction to the English translation of the phenomenon of man, which gave it quite an aspect of prestige, that Huxley would introduce Teilhard's work. But of course, Teilhard had passed away, and he was never to appreciate the publication of the phenomenon of man or Julian Huxley's kind thoughts about the work. So it's an all-around sad situation for the Jesuit priest, Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, who we honor today. I think whether one accepts Teilhard in part or in whole, or just rejects him, one will benefit in some way from reading the phenomenon of man. How he was so creative, and how he foreshadowed the internet, how he recognized the convergence of our species, how he saw coming out of the human diversity, which he experienced in Egypt, an emerging unity. So these are all great insights on his part, but they went beyond most of his contemporaries. No, one remembers Giordano Bruno, who argued for an infinite number of stars and planets and intelligent beings on other worlds. And he was tortured and burned alive at the stake because it didn't agree with the Aristotelian or the Roman Catholic view of things. So people have literally been intellectually and in some cases physically and mentally destroyed by a myopic view of things. But these thinkers like Bruno and Galileo and Teilhard and many others are to be commended for their open inquiry and going and having their critical thought expand our view of our species and of the world, despite and not be just grounded in a narrowly conceived past philosophy of things. So I mean, so Teilhard belongs with Bruno and Galileo and many others. You could say even Nietzsche himself, who tried to expand the human conception of the world, life, and our species.
Indeed. Thank you so much, Professor Birx. Let us give the floor to other online speakers and viewers who would perhaps like to pose a question. Please feel free to pose a question to Professor Birx.
May I?
Of course, please do. Professor Dr. Boris Cizel, our
Thank you.
most distinguished professor, from Ljubljana, Slovenia.
Thank you, Professor Birx, for bringing us closer to understanding the conceptual framework that Pierre de Chardin was working on. My question would be, in reading his texts, would you have a feeling that he has questioned himself the reasons why human evolution is relatively slow? By that I mean that in all these centuries, humanity has still not gone beyond violence and exploitation of man by man, while of course now we are much more aware, and during his lifetime he probably would have been, that there are ways how human race can be more humane and therefore of course also more successful.
Well, if I understand your question, Teilhard was always an optimist. Despite his experiences during the war, which Professor Liliana Markovic referred to, despite his own personal sad experiences, particularly concerning the publication of his works, which were not allowed, he remained an optimist. Even though he was a broken man near the end of his life, he was more or less optimistic. He thought that the human species would evolve and would improve as it became more and more collective. and he had great hope for the human future. So he was not discouraged by the wars. He was not discouraged by the evil in the world. In fact, he thought that through time, evil will diminish, and this divine milieu that he spoke of will increase until it reaches this omega point, which would be the ultimate end of the evolution of consciousness in this divine center, which includes all human beings, their immortal souls, with a personal, loving, creative God. So he remained an optimist, and he was determined to remain optimistic because he thought that if he gave in to his critics, that it would damage his philosophical view. He wanted to be optimistic because he believed that that is the only course that our species can take if it is to survive and reach this divine goal as he saw it. So despite his own personal struggles, he remained optimistic in order to, you might say, personally verify his positive view of human evolution, not only for now, but for the future. So it's remarkable that he did not leave the society, which he could have. He could have left the Jesuit society. He did not. He chose not to. He thought if he left the society, it would do an injustice to himself and to his philosophy. So he never seriously entertained leaving the Jesuit society, which is something very interesting to reflect on. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Yes, yes, please. Mr. Frank Frost.
Thank you. First, I just want to say, Professor Birx, that Mary and I are absolutely delighted to congratulate you on this wonderful presentation. We know how difficult it is to take his life and concisely put it in context, particularly in your case, philosophical context. And we also just want to thank you for participating in our film, Teilhard, Visionary Scientist, and to let the audience know that it was not just a small interview that you did, but that you were a counselor all along, and that you've been working on Teilhard for many, many years. And so you're bringing a tremendous history to that. And in particular, you and your colleague Branko went to Egypt. We couldn't take our team to Egypt, but you went to Egypt and did the research there and took photographs that we could use to tell that part of the story. And so we're going to especially thank you for that. If I may go on just for a couple more seconds here, I want to also thank Liliana for bringing to the fore that question of Teilhard's why he was well, maybe it was really a question. You said he's a broken man at the end of his life, and Liliana put the finger on the fact that he was a spiritual man. He was deeply committed to his priesthood, and even we in our film do not say enough about the fact that he was deeply committed to his priesthood, and it was because he was conflicted because he was a priest, but he also was going against the church's notion of evolution. He could believe a certain amount of Darwin, but there was more to it. And you mentioned how Birx gave him some solution to that. But for him, evolution resolved his conflict, how he could both be a priest and be a scientist. And that, because he was so excited about that he thought he had to go to the Catholic Church, that they could actually allow the Catholic Church to talk to scientists and listen to scientists, and it would enrich the church tremendously. And it was because of that that in addition to just having his natural ego, compromised by not having his books published, the fact that he couldn't publish those works was the church telling him, no, we're not going to let you teach us, bring us further into the 20th century. And so that's what really broke him, because of his deep commitment to his faith and his deep commitment to the Jesuits and his total commitment to science. So we say in our film, about the film, that he is somebody who brought science and faith together. And that's something we need today. So that leads me to my question, which is, in today's world, I mean, he was as much rejected by the scientific world after he published his books and died, than as he was by the church. Today, you sense that there's a greater acceptance of Teilhard's philosophy in the world of science?
Well, that's a challenging question, difficult to answer. There were scientists, important scientists during Teilhard's life, towards the end of his life, who did accept some of his ideas, like Sir Julian S. Huxley that I mentioned, Theodosius Dobzhansky, the geneticist, and there were others. Today, as I said, I think that we can appreciate his anticipating the internet. We can appreciate his anticipation of the convergence of our species. As far as his teleology, well, that's a different matter. Is the evolutionary process directional? Well, I have my own concept, which I call emerging teleology. That is to say that even though organic evolution is probably not directional throughout millions and millions of years of the emergence of and extinction of species, that today, as a result of human intervention, our species can guide its further evolution more and more through nanotechnology and genetic engineering, to the point where we can transform ourselves into what's referred to as a transhuman, and then maybe they can transform themselves into post-humans. And we have no idea where this process could end. So Teilhard was instrumental in some ways in foreseeing the internet and taking a positive view toward the factual theory of organic evolution. Probably most scientists would not accept his concept of the omega point. Probably not. But nevertheless, Teilhard is important in the history of interpreting evolution for some of the ideas that he expressed in his writings. And so he will be remembered as a fascinating and innovative thinker in evolutionary thought. Whether they accept him wholeheartedly, I doubt it. But that doesn't diminish Teilhard's scientific research, his scientific publications, his conception of the internet, and his focus on the evolution of our species and what it may lead to, and the need for optimism and the need for values. You could even say in terms of human beings loving each other, because it seems to me since the pandemic that this aspect of loving relationships has diminished. I mean, as I have experienced the world now, I don't know what happened to it, but Teilhard was aware of the fact that we can only progress, whether in Christianity or any other religion, by being helpful to each other's and by having an optimistic view of our future. And he was, as I said, an optimist to the very end, which is incredible, despite the fact that he was not accepted by some of his superiors. And in fact, you mentioned other scientists. Most of the scientists that Teilhard worked with were absolutely unaware of his own ideas and his writings. I mean, it's incredible. And he mingled with many important anthropologists and biologists. Lastly, I have to mention that Teilhard was not a pantheist. He did not believe that God is the universe, but you could argue that in some ways, he reminds one of Giordano Bruno, he reminds one of Baruch Spinoza, he reminds one of Albert Einstein, in the sense that his view of God was so all-encompassing that it included the universe, despite the fact that God, for Teilhard, is autonomous and has his own personal identity above and beyond the universe. But he belongs in that tradition of quasi-pantheistic thinkers or panentheistic thinkers, that God and the universe are interrelated in this evolutionary process. A very interesting view of things that one can ponder when one has the time to. But as I said, we are happy to remember him today. He deserves to be remembered, and he did have some very important insights about the future of evolution. Although I must say it's ironic that only a few years after his death, Neil Armstrong walked on the surface of the moon, and I don't think Teilhard ever thought of such a thing happening. So you can see how fast science and technology progress.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Birx, for your excellent, wonderful, inspiring answer. And thank you so much, Professor Frank Frost and Madame Mary, for this great question and this great view, and also this unsurpassable 2-hour documentary, very, very spirited and full of knowledge and great angles of insight about Pierre Teilhard de Chardin.
Let me encourage everyone who ever watches this Zoom production that they see Teilhard, visionary scientist, produced by Frank Frost and Mary Frost. It's an outstanding introduction. It's 2 hours long, but it literally flies by.
Yes.
I was so impressed, among other things, with the beautiful cinematography and the wonderful historic clips from the world wars. It's just incredible. You actually live Teilhard's life in this documentary, and I hope eventually it gets the honors and awards that it richly deserves for presenting Teilhard's life in this incredible film.
Thank you very much. I'd like to honor my editor, Bob Kenner, on the left, who is largely responsible for this film, because the editing is an incredibly important part of the effect that you described. As a practical matter, I will send to you, Liliana and James, a link that will allow anybody, even internationally, to directly stream the film, so that anybody who's interested can watch it.
Thank you so much. This will be a wonderful opportunity to deepen our understanding of Pierre's worldview, which I think is so precious for us to understand. Thank you so much again, Professor Frost, Madame Mary, and Professor Kenner, and all other people who contributed with their patient work and inspired insights to the beauty and the perfection of your film, of this great achievement. And I would like to thank our assistant, Mr. Branko Milicevic, for his beautiful photographs, which he took with so much love and dedication, that contributed to some lovely scenes in this great film, which we will enjoy, which I enjoyed, and which we will all enjoy, thanks to your generosity from now onwards. This is certainly a landmark, and I somehow believe that Pierre Teilhard de Chardin's time is coming, because we need to find solutions. Even if we don't accept his worldview, we will come to our own worldview, which will somehow harmonize the church dogma, the teaching of Christianity, and the advancement of science, which is galloping at the moment. I mean, now we have artificial intelligence, which is sort of coming in full force and at great speed. So we need to adapt, otherwise we will become extinct as a species. Thank you so much. Excuse me, are there any more questions from the online audience, please? Are there any other questions from the hall or from online?
Yeah, this is Bob Canner, the editor of the film.
Oh, hello. Thank you. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Professor Birx, for your participation. The camera loved you, so you did great. In the first iteration of the film, which was about 3.5 hours, we had the Scopes monkey trial. And I'm curious if Teilhard even ever knew, because of the communications of the day, if he even knew about it and what you think he might have thought about it.
I have no idea if he knew about the so-called Scopes monkey trial. I think he would have been appalled, to say the least, because for him, there was no question of the fact of evolution. It's a matter of interpretation from evolutionist to evolutionist. But to have the creationists ridicule a scientific fact, I think he would have found it abhorrent. And there certainly was no place for him at this so-called trial, because he was all for convergence, the convergence of humanity, the convergence of science and theology, the convergence of facts and concepts, the convergence of values on a worldwide scale. And this little trial in Tennessee, although it was very popular, and some claim it was partially contrived, would certainly not appeal to him. I mean, what would he do if he was there? I mean, but can you imagine Pierre Teilhard de Chardin sitting in the at the trial? I can't even imagine such a thing. But it is a part of intellectual history concerning the acceptance of or rejection of evolution, and we can't ignore, but we can see how dangerous a little knowledge can be. I mean, those people against evolution couldn't pass a kindergarten question on evolution. You know, it's just amazing how people will believe what they want to believe and ignore overwhelming empirical evidence. This must have occurred to Teilhard many times, that there's this overwhelming evidence. It grows exponentially every year, and yet people choose to absolutely ignore it. So it's just incredible. I guess you have to fight the good battle, the good war, and hope that eventually truth wins out. And for Teilhard, the truth was, of course, convergence and synthesis. And he's to be admired for that. I mean, he never gave up the idea that somehow evolutionary science and Christian values, Christian beliefs could be reconciled, if not during his lifetime, perhaps decades in the future.
So if I may just add an ironic coincidence, this is the 100th anniversary this year of the Scopes monkey trial in Tennessee, in which a teacher was convicted of breaking the law by teaching evolution. In the same month and year that was going on, Teilhard was being censured by the Jesuits. That's the same month and year that he was exiled to China. And so we're kind of celebrating two things this year.
Well, I think we're celebrating one thing more than the other. If I can, I mean, so.
Yes. It was true celebration.
I'm trying to think of the name of the famous lawyer who defended the school, Clarence Darrow. Teilhard may have been interested in meeting him. The great Clarence Darrow. The
other irony was that that trial turned in part on the fact that they claimed there was no fossil evidence for evolution from primate to human, and Teilhard was one of the finders of Peking Man, which provided that fossil evidence.
Well, as I said, the Homo erectus fossil evidence from South Chaldien was so crucial as a link between the earlier Australopithecines and later Homo sapiens, and that was during his time, and he was there, the most important hominid or human fossil site in the world. How ironic to exile him from France for his evolutionary views and placing him square in the center of the South Chaldien excavations. I mean, I find this overwhelming, perhaps divine intervention.
Yes.
I mean, it is quite ironic if you think about it.
But it is really divine intervention, because this is a small fact, but it is a fact that justifies the need to harmonize the religious dogma with Pierre's very hard work, very consistent and continuous work on discovering the Peking man, because he was digging as well as,
Yes, he
in
was.
my opinion, more difficult part, and that was taking the evidence out of China at the time. Just remember the years.
Yes, the war was going on.
Yes, and he took out that they had a caravan with horses, etc., saddled by all these excavation materials. That was a real success. That was a real achievement, just to take out this evidence and preserve it and take it to a safe place.
Well,
So,
yes, exactly.
so this was this just had to happen that way, so that the academic community of the world could have the proof for the missing link, for the so-called missing link. And this is where Pierre's greatness is yet to be discovered and analyzed and more celebrated. And this is why I admire you and Professor Frank Frost and Professor Ganner for making this wonderful film, for writing about Pierre Teilhard, and for holding this evening in remembrance of Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, because I think his contribution, his very difficult life's contribution, is great and grand to the academic community of the world.
Mhm.
Are there any more questions, highly esteemed colleagues, in the online or in the on-site audiences?
Hello, I have a question.
Hello.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much, Professor Dr. Birx, for your lovely presentation. My question is just a quick one. As someone that's in the next generation, and also very interested in education policy and curriculum, I'm just thinking about, and maybe speaking on the behalf of our students that are also present online, how can we, as the next generation, live up to the legacy of Pierre, and keep him as relevant as possible through education and through curriculum, etc. So if you have any ideas, that would be interesting.
And this is our colleague, Ms. Yelisaveta Agatonovic, who is now in New York, if I'm correct.
Yes.
Thank
Yes.
you.
Well, of course, Teilhard was buried in New York City. He spent his last 5 years, most of them, in New York City. How to make Teilhard relevant, how to make him remembered for his work, is that the essence of your question? How to promote him? How?
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, I would think, well, one way to promote him is for your students to watch Teilhard, visionary scientist, and to discuss Teilhard's life after watching this excellent documentary, and what they glean from this film in terms of Teilhard's dedication to science, his dedication to the priesthood, and also they could, it would be difficult to read for some of them, The Phenomenon of Man. But what role did Teilhard play in the discovery of Peking man? What role did Teilhard play in envisioning United Nations in terms of a global civilization? In fact, it's interesting that this University for Peace was established by the United Nations, and here we are at its European center talking about Teilhard, who of course was in favor of uniting nations in a global noosphere, or a global layer of mind, or a global layer of thought for the benefit of everyone, for the survival of our species. So You could begin with the film. You could begin maybe with reading some of Teilhard's essays. And if this Zoom production becomes available, they could watch it. Let me see. Well, I think that's it. The film, his writings, and what do they think were Teilhard's lasting contributions? I mentioned some of them. To the further evolution of our species, like the fact of evolution, the coming of the internet, which is with us now, although Teilhard didn't anticipate the coming of artificial intelligence, and to my knowledge, and the convergence of our species, as I said. So he's very interesting and very important historically for anticipating a new view of the world in terms of human evolution, in terms of a collective consciousness, the unity of our species, which is necessary for its further progress, as I see it, as he saw it. I don't know if that answers your question, but
No, it does. It definitely, it provokes
discussion.
some ideas about kind of like lesson planning and yeah, like making it, including that in kind of the humanities. I think it's a part of education that I missed, like this part. So that would be interesting to kind of bring it back. I mean, we speak about evolution and those ideas, but not to this extent with this much information and material, etc. So
By the way,
thank you. That was very helpful.
you could consult my award-winning academic book of the year, Theories of Evolution.
Yes.
I don't know if you're aware of it, but it's Theories of Evolution. It's on Amazon.com. You could get a copy or at a library. It goes through all of the major evolutionists, including an extensive coverage of Darwin and Teilhard and all of the other major evolutionists. And you can see that there's a spectrum of evolutionary interpretations, from strict materialism through different forms of vitalism to spiritualism and finally mysticism. So evolution may be a fact, but there's a wide range of interpretations of the process, and Theories of Evolution focuses on it. A later version of Theories of Evolution is called Interpreting Evolution. It's basically the same, but it's a later book, and you can consult these two books for different interpretations. And compare and contrast them, like comparing and contrasting Darwin with Teilhard, or Teilhard with Nietzsche, as I did very briefly. It's very interesting to compare and contrast Pierre Teilhard de Chardin with Friedrich Nietzsche. You can see how far apart they are, but they both present a theory of evolution or an interpretation of evolution. Thank you for your question, and thank you, all of you, for your questions.
Yes, thank you so much for Professor Birx for answering all of these very, very challenging questions and thought-inspiring questions by your great answers. May I ask if there are any other questions online or on site? If there are no further questions, may I ask Professor Milica Tasevska to close this session? Let me just say in the end how grateful we all are to Professor Dr. H. James Birx for his wonderful contribution to our academic community this evening. And let me thank you all online and on site for participating. On behalf of our Executive Director, academician, Professor Dr. Negoslav Ostojic, who is the head of ECPD, of the University for Peace established by the United Nations. We were very privileged, let me say again, to have this lecture this evening. Thank you. And Professor Tasevska, the floor is yours, please.
Thank you very much. Dear professors, dear colleagues, I'm very great, dear Professor Birx. I'm very grateful to be present this evening with us and to share and to hear every time something new, big and important from my dear Professor Birx, I know from 15 years. I hope that we will see very soon. And a big thank you for following this lecture from Professor James Birx.
Thank you. Good night, everybody.
Good night, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Goodbye.
Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. All the best.
Dear Professor Marcus, thank you.
Dear Professor Tasevska, thank you. Thank you, Professor Frost, Madame Mary, everyone. Thank you.